rise of generative AI, super consequential for nation states and for matters of economics, productivity, defense, and even culture. While we believe the U.S. has an early lead here, China remains a very formidable competitor. This is not just a U.S.-China thing. We think there are a number of countries that are and will become more important to this phenomenon over time. We won't live in a world that'll be dominated by one or two or three very large closed source models. How inspired India will be by its success in the digital stack initiatives and creating open data commons and having well-governed programmatic approach to innovation, I think that's going to be a signature dimension of India's contribution to the generative AI revolution.
Welcome to today's podcast episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we bring you smart, insightful, big picture conversations about the intersection of technology, geopolitics, business, entrepreneurship, and current affairs. And today I'm privileged, delighted to have George Lee with us here on the podcast. George is a member of the management committee at Goldman Sachs. He's the co-head of the Applied Innovation Group, which we'll come to. He's previously been the co-chief information officer at Goldman and also the co-chair of the Global Tech, Media and Telecom Group, the TMT Group. He's also the chair of the Board of Trustees at an extremely prestigious college called Middlebury College. And as a fellow liberal arts college alum from Haverford, it's a college I greatly admire. And George, the last nugget that I'll share is also a fellow Wharton alum. And so I'm delighted to have George, you with us on the podcast today. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And yet you and I have a very shared educational background, which is interesting. But it's a pleasure here. And it's been very fun having some offline conversations with you over the past year.
Yeah, and likewise. And so I'm delighted to cover, the gamut of technology, geopolitics, and business topics with you today. And I know you've been spending maybe even more time, or at least as much time as I have been, on the intersection of those three things, especially with the new group, with the Applied Innovation Group. So why don't we get started with you telling us a little bit more about that group, why that got set up, why Goldman felt the need for that group, and what is it that you're looking at within that group?
Great. Well, really, in some ways, it's born out of the opportunity we had to add Jared Cohen to the ranks of senior people at Goldman Sachs. And I know that you know Jared, but Jared was in the State Department for many years. Then he worked for Eric Schmidt at Alphabet and Google, and he joined us about 2 years ago. And he joined us with the idea of, really driving the firm forward in two dimensions. One is expressing thought leadership and sharing it with our clients around the very intersection that you address, again, geopolitics, technology change, and markets. And then second, encouraging, motivating, and inspiring more innovation inside the firm. Many of those innovations are things that may be expressed ultimately outside the firm as we build businesses that we can externalize, et cetera. And so, it's really that dual mission that we're pursuing in partnership.
Yeah, no, I think we're seeing a collision of these various worlds, right? I think technology just a decade ago, I think, was not being talked about in the same breath as geopolitics, but it is. I think innovation is now also at the core of geopolitics. I think applied innovation obviously is very important from a markets and business standpoint. I think we're finding, like we have seen for several decades, that companies also that don't stay at the cutting edge of innovation can very easily, in a world dominated by fast evolving technology, can very quickly become irrelevant. And so I think it's a timely initiative. As part of the thought leadership that you're doing at the firm and as part of the Applied Innovation Group, I know there's a piece that I want to talk to you a fair bit about, which is a piece that you wrote about the geopolitics of AI, which we'll get into. Let me set a little bit of the context here, why I thought that was an important piece for us to discuss on the podcast as well. As you know, you have a copy of the book that I wrote a little while ago, The Great Tech Game. I feel like that today we are now in the maybe the early stages of what I'm calling the great AI game, where artificial intelligence as a new wave of technology is driving a whole set of new competitive dynamics, right? Both in markets as well as between nations. Right? At the same time, is triggering a lot of thinking, a lot of concern sometimes, but a lot of sense of opportunity, massive opportunity as well in the coming years and decades from a business standpoint, from a country competitiveness standpoint, and also for individuals and firms just, from a progress standpoint. And as part of this great AI game, you're seeing that even the last few months have shown us how big the stakes are getting so quickly, right? You have large tech firms that are rushing to, introduce new LLMs, get the best talent on board, invest large amounts of capital. At the same time, at the country level, you're finding that countries are starting to develop their own AI strategies. Many countries have put out AI strategies over the last few years. Individuals and firms and corporate leaders are starting to think about how business models will get impacted. So it's really the rumblings have begun, and so your piece on the geopolitics of AI in that sense could not have been more timely. So I want to ask you your views on this global AI competition, right? What I'm calling the great AI game. How are you seeing this play out?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would observe both of your book is fantastic, and the work that you've done subsequently, including this podcast. I think you've really been pointing at these issues very presciently for a while. So, kudos to you for that. And maybe one quick digression that I think you probably would share is, while we put this idea together for the Office of Applied Innovation about 2 years ago, subsequent events have really served to ratify the rationale behind it. I mean, 2 years ago, we lived in a world where US-China competition was really important and it was acting out in geopolitics and technology. But fast forward 2 years, we now have we have that sharpening. We have the rise of hot conflicts around the world and the emergence of generative AI, which we think is a kind of a world-changing technology. And so it's just remarkable, better lucky than smart in some ways, of forming this group at the time that we did, because these topics are now momentous and frontal for boards, for countries, for politicians, for policymakers around the world. So, just as you've experienced with your work, I'm sure you're seeing this too. It's a complicated time in the world, but it's a very fruitful time for expressing thought leadership about these topics. Now, on the topic you raised, yes, I mean, this is a technology. The rise of generative AI is one that is super consequential for nation states. And if you think about matters of economics, productivity, defense, and even culture itself, this technology is going to have profound impact, obviously on all of us as individuals, on companies, but really almost uniquely for a technology change on nation states, countries, and regions. And so that's why it's so fascinating to embark on the study of this phenomenon, and be able to have access to and talk to world leaders about it, because it is a fast-breaking, fairly recent, momentous technology change that's going to influence the course of policy, politics, and competition, global
And
competition.
business. No, that's right. And markets. No, definitely. You've argued in your piece, George, that at least on the generative AI piece, right, of the broader set of technologies that AI constitutes, the US is leading, right? I want to ask you to explain on what metrics, on what parameters do you think the US is leading, and how are some of the other countries faring on some of those metrics as well?
Yep. Well, first I would say, look, the most important point, this is a global phenomenon. And while I think the U.S. does have a lead and played a role in the spawning of this revolution, which I'll talk about, this is a global phenomenon. And what's fascinating is to see how this innovation has spread globally, how different countries and regions have important inputs and things to add to this. It's definitely a global phenomenon. But I think the reason we argued that, at least in the early going, the US is taking a leadership position here is just really around the locality of the key inputs to this phenomenon. The intellectual leadership, as you well know, the generative AI movement really spawned in 2017 by a paper emerging out of Google. And while that team was very transnational in its character, emerged from a U.S. company, a bunch of people operating in Silicon Valley. So the intellectual roots of generative AI in many ways lie in the United States. Second, this phenomenon relies on clearly semiconductor innovation, in particular the work of NVIDIA and the importance of graphical processing units to enabling this revolution that sort of emerged from the U.S. Chip design, a lot of the intellectual leadership there coming from the U.S. The infrastructure, the hosts and the infrastructure providers that are allowing these workloads to occur, largely dominated by the hyperscalers in the US, people like Microsoft and Amazon and Google. And then finally, a lot of the innovation in the application space of this particular node of AI is emerging from the US. Now, that is in the early going, and I think it's important, and it echoes in some ways the innovation that occurred around the rise of the internet, which very quickly got globalized and unique brands of it got created elsewhere. And I would expect the same thing to happen. And we think there are a number of countries that are and will become more important to this phenomenon over time. One of the ones that we write about most is the US-China competition and how it'll act out here. And my colleague Jared Cohen, I referenced earlier, has made the observation that, if you look back over time, the US had kind of a 30-year lead over China on technology innovation, and China largely caught up. In fact, prior to 2017, you might have said that China had stolen the march from the US on AI innovation. And there's a lot of data around the number of research papers emerging from China, the amount of time, energy, assets around this. This node, which, as I said, has a certain locality to the US, I think has reasserted the United States' opportunity to lead in this space. And China labors under some unique limitations in this area. First of all, the nexus of US and China competition has resulted in things like sanctions and export controls and things that have limited their ability to get access to some of the fundamental enabling infrastructure. Second, the amount and character of training data, linguistic training data that's important for these algorithms is less of a, the English language corpus of that data is broader than the Chinese language corpus of the data. And the early research was not oriented around Chinese language, training data. So that's been, a hill they've had to climb. And then, probably most interestingly, these machines have an emergent and unpredictable quality. And so if you look, China has been a very ardent and early regulator of this technology because, it's super important for them as a country that, social harmony and alignment around socialist ideals are paramount to the way that system works. And so a chatbot which has unpredictable outputs is, somewhat threatening to a regime with that orientation. And their regulatory approach has been to be very focused around the veracity of training data, which is hard to assert and validate, and also the consistency of outputs with socialist doctrine. And again, given that the systems are emergent, it's hard to guarantee the outputs will be consistent with any given doctrine or orientation.
No, that's right. That's right. Of course, just to stay on that US-China piece, and I want to come to the US strategy also in a bit, but on the question of whether China can catch up here, right? Of course, I think the pieces you mentioned are valid, but of course, nothing stops the Chinese big tech firms from also crawling the English web and leveraging that data, right? Or is there a way that would prevent them from accessing that data?
No, and I thank you for raising the question in this spirit because while we believe the U.S. has an early lead here, China remains a very formidable competitor with enormous intellectual capital, financial capital, and just clout and throw weight to compete here, and they will. So a few interesting examples of that are, some of the commercial chatbot efforts by folks like Baidu are exhibiting, very competitive capabilities with U.S. foundation and global foundational models. Second, I referenced the export control and sanctions challenges to China, in particular, getting access to the silicon that is the underlying fundamental predicate for a lot of these algorithms. China's made remarkable and surprising progress, even in the absence of some of the U.S. originated IP in this area. I think you've written about and talked about the new Huawei phone, which has silicon created at a 7 nanometer geometry, which is surprised the rest of the world at their ability to kind of off ramp from global standards and build their own silicon at that level of sophistication. So by no means am I counting out China in this, and I think they'll again be a formidable adversary and competitor. And something we can talk about later, China had surpassed the U.S. in their ability to garner training data for certain kind of pre-generative dimensions of AI. So, facial recognition data, IoT data, health data, et cetera. Those data sets, while less salient for training large language models in the first instance, may be extremely important in allowing those models to create value in those domains. So I think they're going to get paid back for that in the next phases of this evolution.
No, that's a very interesting point. No, that's right. I think as the LLMs also evolve to more image and other kinds of data, then the databases that China has developed, right, with facial recognition and other such nodes might actually become more relevant. I think it's a fair point. What about other countries, George? So, one of the things that I had Chris Miller also on the podcast a few weeks ago, and one of the things we talked about was as the US and China battle or competition plays out in AI, one of the key things that the US is doing, I think you were also referencing it, is on the hardware side, on the infrastructure side, with export controls comes another piece of the US strategy, which is alliances, right? So countries like Netherlands, Japan, Taiwan, and others, where together with these countries, there's high chance that you might be able to deny, as the US, deny access to the hardware, the infrastructure layer, the equipment, right, that Netherlands and ASML provide, the advanced leading fabs, all of those things. Is your sense that that's a piece that China can overcome in the absence of similar allies and friends?
Well, first, I think China is deliberate and thoughtful around creating their own alliances and set of relationships around the world, and they have a lot to offer in that regard. And so, yeah, I don't think that the U.S. should believe. Well, while we believe that these export controls and these measures are important, we shouldn't believe that we can forestall or prevent innovation from occurring in China that's going to be highly competitive and consequential. I mean, I think it's going to happen. As you referenced, though, this is not just a U.S.-China thing at all. In fact, one of the things I think it's cool and inspiring is that intellectual and capacity leadership in this area is going to come from all different corners of the world. And you and I have talked a lot, and my particular enthusiasm for India, for its role in the world, for its role in the innovation ecosystem. And I think in this domain, India has so much to offer the world. First of all, by dint of the intellectual capital in this country, the emerging economic throw weight, which is so significant, and by the success that you've had. By the way, you pointed this out to me. I've stolen this talking point from you, so I have to footnote you here. How inspired India will be by its success in the digital stack initiatives.
Yeah.
and creating open data commons and having a very kind of well-governed programmatic approach to innovation. I think that's going to be a signature dimension of India's contribution to the generative AI revolution. And so I'm very excited to see that play out here. Look, you've got countries like England, who have a lot of academic leadership in this area. The EU, France in particular, I think has a legacy and history and intellectual resources and capital resources that'll be important here. Both of those taking leading roles around this effort of around the quest to regulate appropriately this new technology. Then, as you said, there's a series of people with particular technology edges like Netherlands, South Korea, Taiwan, et cetera, who are going to play important roles. And then you have these interesting other eccentric but powerful nations like the United Arab Emirates,
Yep.
who've been a leader creating their own very, very capable and impressive open source model in Falcon. They've done really important work in Arabic large language models. They're investing prolifically. So again, I think it's a global phenomenon, and I hope while I talked about it as a nexus or an axis for competition in the world, I also hope it has a kind of unifying impact on the world and on nation states as well.
Yeah, and you don't want the competition to become conflictual, right? I think
Exactly.
that's the balance that the world has to find in geopolitics as well as in tech, as well as maybe in business and markets, that the competition should remain to whatever extent it can healthy, but not conflictual of the kind that then leads us to geopolitical battles or wars that then actually prevent that innovation from moving forward. I think that's a critical point.
It is. By the way, it bears on a really interesting thing, which you and I have also talked about in the past is, will this be an open source or a closed source phenomenon? And to the extent it's more open source in its nature, obviously, I think it has a greater opportunity to be transnational, an opportunity for unity rather than conflictual engagement, as you put it. So I think that's an interesting thing yet to be fully determined, though I think the weight of history and the weight of current momentum lies in a more open source phenomenon here.
No, so that's interesting. I think this open source versus closed LLM debate, right, is something that we've been seeing emerge more and more now the last few months. At the Global Technology Summit, that we held in Delhi recently, hosted by Carnegie and the Ministry of External Affairs in India. One of the key themes that came out, right, from prominent thinkers in the Indian tech space, including Nandan Nilekani, who helped in many ways the digital public infrastructure revolution that you and I have discussed, right, with the Aadhaar and UPI and the India Stack, as we call it. One of the things that was discussed was this idea of whether a country like India, right, as it figures out its own AI strategy and niche within the global AI space, should also focus more on open source models as opposed to getting into this race of building, the largest LLMs of the kinds that OpenAI, of course, right? So there's almost two sets of philosophies now emerging, right, that you're referencing. You have Mistral and I think Llama 2 and other such open source based approaches. And of course, you have OpenAI and others who are not as open source driven. And you just said that you expected to go more towards open source. So I want to ask you why you think that. And also whether you feel that these LLMs will ultimately get commoditized and the real innovation, real wealth generation, real value add will only happen at the application layer. Will they become commoditized and become almost like electric utilities in a way?
Great. Well, first of all, on the India point, look, this is your area of expertise, not mine, and most of what I've learned about it, I've learned from you. But I think my guess is that the technology ethos of India will send this in a more open source direction. Again, the digital stack, the India stack, the notion of creating a platform that's enabling, commercial enterprises to benefit from that open commons, et cetera. Like, I just think that the success of that will infuse and inform the way the country addresses addresses this generative AI revolution, with the slight offset of also the country rightly being concerned about regulation, um, guardrails, appropriateness, et cetera. So some balance there. So why open versus closed, and why my bias is slightly, though not determinatively, on the side of open source? A lot of it has to do with the way that these models have evolved in recent periods. So in the early days of this revolution, um, the emergent models were closed source models, and they were characterized by larger and larger scale, more parameters, more computation, more training runs, more data. And in recent periods, we've seen a companion, and those continue along that trajectory. More open source efforts have gone in the direction of scale down,
Yeah.
smaller parameter counts, observing different scaling laws about the amount of computation that needs to be attached to it, and all the way to the point where you have people like Microsoft releasing the Phi 2 model, which is 2.7 billion parameters relative to the reputed 1.8 trillion parameters of GPT-4. That sort of scale down ethos, I think it implies a proliferation of a number of different models in the world, which again is sort of a profoundly open source phenomenon. And we won't live in a world that'll be dominated by one or two or three very large closed source models. Rather, I think there'll be a cooperation between closed and open in this regard, where increasingly these big closed source models, which were born they were extremely capable but quite isolated, are now open themselves through various interfaces, plugins, APIs, et cetera, to the world around them. And while these big models may have unique capabilities around world knowledge and some simulacrum of reasoning capability, their ability to cooperate with, to call upon smaller domain-specific models that will, I think, largely be open source in character, may mean that, again, I see a bias towards open source innovation in this world. I think Meta is one of the extreme leaders here. I also think we may just have this a little bit like we do in our tech ecosystem at large, an interplay of closed source technologies and open source technologies. So it'll be some blend, but I think this is going to be a more open phenomenon than was initially believed.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting and I think very consequential, right? I think if it ends up being even a mix, right, and not just closed, I think that'll have a massive consequence on how the innovation ecosystem actually ends up developing in AI. Of course, people try and find historical precedents to hang on to understand how this might develop, right, in the future. Our ability to predict the future often relies, I think, on whatever frames or heuristics we have from the past. And, a couple come to mind, and I want to ask you if you use some in your head also to figure out how this might play out. Of course, we have the precedent of search, where by virtue of becoming the most innovative search engine, Google was able to build a platform and dominate it, for decades now, right? And Bing and others have not been able to chip away at that very consequently, at least thus far. You have the idea of the operating system, so Google's Android and Amazon's iOS. And of course, the Chinese have built out their own operating systems, but it's been a few limited ones, and those have been large enablers of wealth to and royalties and, the 20 to 30% commissions to flow back to the Play Store and all of that. What are some of the maybe earlier heuristics or precedents you can rely on to say, yes, this actually might go more the open source way or a mixed blended model, as you were just saying?
Yeah, I mean, this is funny. This is one of the debates that I have actively with Marco Argenti, who was my former co-chief information officer at Goldman, is now our sole CIO and a fantastic thinker on these topics. And we debate, whether this generative AI phenomenon is more analogous to an operating system, to something on the application layer, something like search, which is fundamentally an application layer. And I think the jury's out actually in how this will ultimately get expressed. I think one of the things that we all have to remind ourselves is, again, while the intellectual roots of this particular node of innovation date from 2017, it crashed into the public consciousness only about a year and a half ago. We are so early in in this phenomenon that a lot of the forward path is emergent and yet to be determined. But we do try to reason around this question of, is this more like an operating system or an application level thing? And that judgment will be that outcome will be very determinative to the path forward here. Feels to me, I'm a little bit biased towards thinking about it more as an application. Marco has a little bit more of a mental model anchoring around operating system, but both of us, I think, see both sides of that.
Yeah. I want to come now to, I think I agree with you. I think the jury is out, but I was curious to get your thoughts, and I think we'll see how this plays out. I want to come to the other concept that you've laid out in your paper, and it's not the first time you guys have talked about it, which is the concept of swing states.
Yeah.
Right. And going back to the global sort of competition aspect of AI that we were talking about, I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that. Geopolitically, of course, swing states make sense. But in the context of AI, first lay out for us, obviously, the states that you think are swing states in the context of this AI competition, and why you think they are swing states and not just, relevant players. Could they swing away from, let's say, US and friends group? Is that a real possibility? And if so, in what scenario do you think that could happen in the case of certain countries?
So let me first try to, just for your listeners, encapsulate the notion of geopolitical swing states before I get to AI swing states. So this is something that my partner Jared Cohen, a way of thinking that he's articulated well. It basically, I'll try to make this quick, is we in the early 90s, we lived in a largely unipolar world of, very broad and acknowledged U.S. leadership, on the world stage as, the predominant great power. We then emerged into a world of more multipolarity, the rise of China, its geopolitical significance, its economic throw weight. And what we've observed is that both of those parties, while obviously hugely consequential and important, both have been somewhat reluctant or unable to express the kind of clear global leadership that has characterized prior periods. And what that has permitted is the rise of what we call geopolitical swing states, which are countries that in prior constructs would have aligned very deliberately and consistently with one pole or the other. They are a U.S. affiliate, they're a China or Russia affiliate, et cetera, and they tend to look at the world and vote through that prism. Increasingly, as there's a little bit of vacuum of leadership on the global stage, important nations have the agency to express their alignment on a kind of case-by-case basis.
Issue-by-issue basis, yeah.
Can be kind of single-issue voters, to use a political term, and they can align with China on certain things, they can align with the U.S. on other things, they can align with the EU on other matters. And that gives them a certain, again, agency, flexibility, and power in the world. And India is sort of the paradigmatic example of that. Obviously, a rich history of non-alignment that's characterized, Indian geopolitics. Now I would call it almost more multi-aligned, which is such an important constituent in global leadership. So much emergent power, and able to align with, uniquely with various poles of leadership depending on its own interests and what it believes is best for the world. And so that agency and flexibility. So we've talked about that at a geopolitical level. Now we've also tried to use that in an AI level to say, which is okay, kind of same thing. You've got, two leaders emerging in this world of generative AI in US and China. The countries that we went through earlier that have meaningful power and contributions to make, will they tend to align with one or the other or both in terms of the way these models and this industry evolves? And so, it's early again, it's way too early to determine. And you can see a certain polarity in the way that regulatory approaches are playing out country to country. So, It's less of a conclusion about the way countries are behaving now, but a way of applying a mental model we've used in geopolitics to way things may play out in geotechnical, technological terms.
Yeah, no, and I found that very interesting. I'll tell you why. One of the things that you mentioned, right, is innovation blocks, right? In your piece, if you look at the geopolitical trends you were describing at the world level, where maybe there's a multipolar, or you said there's maybe a vacuum of leadership, global leadership, and hence different countries are finding agency and finding different themes on which they might align differently. One of the ways in which that geopolitical piece or trend is playing out is that countries are forming regional groupings, right? And not so much relying on very large UN style or the traditional Bretton Woods institution style global groupings, but saying we'll form regional groupings which allow us to further our interests, further our collaboration, etc. You have many such examples now in the world, the Quad, AUKUS, you can name many, right? And as I was reading your piece, and the moment I read innovation blocks in the context of swing states, my mind went to those regional groupings, right? And the trend of regional groupings emerge. Is your idea around innovation blocks similar, that you find that maybe, let's say, on open source LLMs, it could be countries that are more aligned towards the open source innovation ecosystem start to work a lot more together versus others that are not close, and then maybe countries that are that have a leg in both open source and closed source LLMs might be in both or might not be in either. Like, what's your concept of innovation blocks, and how do you see that playing out?
It's such a great observation, and as you observed, the Indo-Pacific is a nexus of newly formed alliances and groupings and so forth. I think it's going to be super interesting locality for that. Yeah, I think there's one interesting argument that's been in the news recently for the fact that there will be groupings of like-minded nations and regions that cooperate in this, is the just extraordinary capital costs associated with proliferating and getting to scale these algorithms. And so, Sam Altman reputed to have floated the estimate of requiring some $5 to $7 trillion of capital to bring the full possibility of this to life, which is, it's literally a startling number and a substantial share of global GDP if it came to pass. The capital intensity of this model, and by the energy intensity of these models, may benefit people who cooperate to tackle these challenges in cooperation and mutually fund the development of regional models or national models, et cetera, and sort of diffuse those capital costs across a set of competitors. That might be an interesting impetus for that shift.
Yeah. Let me now shift. We've spoken about tech and geopolitics now for a fair bit, which I know is close to your heart and mine. But I want to move now to AI and economic growth. Right. I think according to the investment research division at Goldman, and I think you've referenced this in your paper as well, AI could drive almost a 1.5% productivity growth, which could be massive for the world. And provide a 7 trillion lift to global GDP, right? With incidentally the same number that
just happens to be a similar number.
But I wanted to dig deeper into that macro piece that you've referenced, right, around the impact of AI on economic output and economic growth around the world. Where, in your sense, right, and where does the research suggest will this growth, both on the productivity side and the GDP jump, likely to come, right? Which sectors, which countries, which segments of the population, right? Which segments of the workforce? Drill down into that for us a bit so we can better understand where and who will benefit most from this economic growth as well.
Yeah. And thank you for referencing that. It's really, I admire and applaud our investment research group in March of last year. So
which, by the way, I'm an alum of.
Awesome. Again, more shared background for us. I really applaud their effort to create a 10-year model away. And I think they wouldn't assert that this, there's any precision to these estimates, but it's a mental model for thinking about the impact. And you articulated the high level impacts. What was really interesting is what under was the undergirding for those conclusions was a very kind of bottoms up approach to looking at 900 occupations in the US and then generalizing that around the world and trying to intuit the degree of task automation that occur for those 700 occupations, again, in a very in a very micro way. And so, like unsurprisingly, they found that the greatest impact, first of all, the greatest impact for task elimination or substitution was going to be in developed markets rather than emerging markets, reflecting the greater preponderance of knowledge work in the former rather than the latter. And so the jobs that were going to be most affected are things like administrative jobs, software development jobs, operational jobs, medical jobs, education in an area. I think this will be profoundly impactful. And then at the bottom of the stack of impact were things that had more of a manual component to them. The other thing I would note is that I think they smartly said this is not just a story of substitution or disruption, but rather augmentation. So one of the things that I've heard people say that was expressed in their study is that this technology is not yet capable of replacing jobs. It's capable of replacing tasks that constitute that are part and parcel of some jobs. And so that's the kind of the way they thought about it. So again, most profoundly anchored and consequential in knowledge industries and knowledge worker jobs, biased towards developed economies versus emerging economies, but in some, extremely profound. I mean, to think about that much GDP impact or that much of a productivity lift, almost, competed only probably by the Industrial Revolution in terms of scale of impact.
Yeah, and by waves within that industrial revolution, like electricity and
electrification is a great one. Yeah,
oh, that's right. That's right. And I think it's also very interesting. I must emphasize, I think the piece that you just mentioned, which is augmentation versus substitution. And I think for long, I had a conversation with an MIT economist, Darren Asimoglu, who's worked for us as well. And one of the things that he was mentioning was that the development part of technology is something that we as humans must consciously think about and choose. It's very easy for technology to be developed in a way that automates and substitutes. And that's what actually often concerns politicians and people at the bottom of the pyramid and emerging economies and, people whose tasks or work is very easily automated and hence could lead to structural displacement, structural deployment. His point was that technology and the path of technology development must be thought of very consciously to make sure that we are augmenting, we're increasing productivity, we're making everyone more productive, as opposed to just thinking about substitution and automation. So I wanted to emphasize that piece and how important that is. I think in the early stages of the AI innovation wave, right? Because I think once the technology path has been chosen and determined in the early years, often we find it later to very hard to reverse, right?
First, Asimoglu is an amazing economist, and I follow his work. I think he's just one of the most provocative and accurate views of this. I ran across a statistic recently. I think it might have been in the Financial Times this past weekend or something that I thought was hugely informative in this regard. And it was a retrospective on the impact of spreadsheets on the world. A revolution that you and I are at the right age to have experienced and seen. And when spreadsheets first came out, first of all, there was a little bit of this moment of like, this is really cool, but what's the, is this going to be impactful? What are we going to use this thing for? Obviously, we found many, many uses for it. But it was also seen initially, there were alarmists that said this is the death knell for accounting jobs.
That's right.
And there's going to be massive technology substitution for jobs. And now we wake up 30 years, 40 years later, there are some 4x or 5x the number of accountants as there were back then. And all it allowed people to do is to be more creative, more insightful, ask broader questions, be deeper in their analysis. And so that characterizes my mental model for this phenomenon in a lot of ways, which is I see this technology predominantly as a tool to elevate humanity and allow us to sublimate and attack, lower value rote tasks, and in partnership with machines, ask and answer questions that have been prohibitively difficult in the past and address some of the most meaningful challenges in front of humanity with a companion, with a thought partner
Yeah.
that will really, raise our impact in the world.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree, and I hope that that ends up being the case, and that this technology evolves in a way that more people can then become accountants, to use your analogy, and for the accountants who do exist, who become accountants, for them to become better accountants, right? More productive, more insightful, and more value add in that sense. And I hope that that's the path this technology takes, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to have these kinds of conversations. So that's how the mental frameworks and mental models develop.
So, we're in agreement with that. At the same time, I don't want to seem Pollyanna-ish about the risks associated with this. There clearly will be job substitution ultimately. Yeah. There'll be disruption, and that will create challenges for pockets of our economy, our economies, and we should be thoughtful and careful. And as Acemoglu seems to have said to you, think forward on that and try to remediate or buffer those effects as best we can, rather than observe them and scramble around after the fact and figure out what we're going to do. So I feel like I have a glass half full optimist's view of how this will play out for jobs and for humanity, but we should be super conscious of there will be disruption, there will be job substitution. We have to think carefully about it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that will determine whether adoption of AI, right, by countries across the world, even if the development of it ends up being a little bit concentrated, which I think many metrics suggest that the development and the cutting edge innovation might be concentrated in a few countries, possibly a few companies, etc. The adoption of it hopefully will be much more widespread.
Agreed.
Some of the things around determinants of adoption is what I want to talk to you next, which is the flow of capital to help in that adoption, the development of talent to ensure that adoption happens, and possibly research, country-specific, sector-specific research that need to happen to make sure that whatever general innovation is happening can be adapted to that particular sector or country's context, right? In similar ways, how we saw the internet play out, right? Venture capital, PE firms went out and supported a lot of entrepreneurs around the world to innovate and adapt models that might have developed in the US or China or wherever else at the beginning. But then you found the adoption then spread. Similarly, on the infrastructure side, large telecom companies went out and spread the internet infrastructure. So I want to ask you your views and thoughts on how you expect AI adoption to play out, and where the flows of capital, research, talent, how those are likely to play out.
Yeah. I think Mark Andreessen and others have talked about this, but I think one thing that is favorable in this regard is there's a certain gravity to techno-economic systems, which to say they're often invented with very precious, very kind of apex capabilities at very high cost that hint at the future direction of a technology, but that the entire the gravitational pull for people who develop those technologies is to democratize them and distribute them as widely as possible. There's a very strong economic impetus to expand the addressable market of what you've invented. And even while in the early going, it may have been targeted to early adopters or, apex consumers of technology, the system encourages a democratic kind of egalitarian world. And that's why you see, early technologies come down in cost and go up that curve of cost and capability. So given that history, I think we should, history would dictate that the purveyors and developers of this technology will have a very strong economic impulse to make this as affordable and prolific as they can. and to reduce the price points of it such that the broadest possible audience in the world can get access, and therefore in the aggregate they can maximize profit under a much bigger curve. So hopefully things will play out in that regard here. This is a little bit different in some ways, just as we've talked about the massive capital requirements here, and what unique motivations or unique phenomenon that will create for the world in terms of how to get payback from that capital. Again, I think the answer is broad proliferation, broad access, but we also have to rely on the companion phenomenon of broadband access, devices, internet access, like reaching the totality of humanity. That, I think, we will solve the abundance of this form of machine intelligence for the world. But the predicate for that is that they have online access, they have devices, they have the ability to get access to this intelligence. And if we can't solve that, this will be a world is not flat, kind of bumpy phenomenon. My hope is that this is a capability that ultimately the entirety of humankind will get access to in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah. No, I worry about the what I've called in my book the second great divergence. Right, that's not a term I've invented. Others have used it, but I found it very pertinent as a mental framework to keep in mind that we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and the parallels AI as possibly with that revolution. And one of the things that revolution leads to is a great divergence between nations, right? Western European and the US being on one side, seeing a massive increase in their GDP and GDP per capita, and then a whole set of other countries that don't see that kind of growth, and leads to a great divergence, which to date exists, right? In many ways, 200, 300 years later. And at the same time, within countries as well. Right? But within countries, you lead into a great sense of like divergence. And that then, of course, has its own implications of, sometimes populist, socialist, labor type movements, right? That say that, listen, we cannot tolerate such a great divergence.
Totally. By the way, this is just yet another area in which I think the world has a lot to learn from India. If you think about the gains that India's made from, again, the digital stack, creating a platform upon which entrepreneurs can build businesses, the innovation around expanding broadband and online access, the driving down of costs of devices, the number of Indian citizens who now have access to sophisticated technology and how that's helped transform your economy. Like, I think that's an inspiration for this function around the rest of the world. And hopefully others are taking notes from the benefits that have accrued to your nation in this regard.
No, definitely. And I think that's a piece that's very important that I try and highlight as well, which is that broader access, that broader sort of level playing field, this idea of data commons, digital commons, that then entrepreneurs can build on top of, is a philosophy that I think can help propagate AI technology also more broadly.
Yeah. But you're just maybe to touch on your point, which is, I do think one of the threats for pockets of humanity in this is that nation states are threatened by the power of this capability, the emergent quality of this capability, and that they want to restrain their citizens from access to this kind of free-form, accessible intelligence. That could really retard development in countries that don't make this available to their citizenry, and do it in a way that, again, affordable, prolific, broad, the way that India has. So that is an area where you could see a break here, a geopolitical break between countries that encourage that kind of access to, kind of omnipresent intelligence in the form of these algorithms versus those who are threatened by it and foreclose it to their citizenry.
So that's right. And I think much like we talk about in the context of individuals, early adopters, right, in terms of countries that are early adopters of this technology, I draw parallels with, countries that were early industrializers, right? I think the benefits will accrue, I think, for a long time, and for large swaths of the population if you are early adopters of this technology, as opposed to being, tech pessimists and retarding the,
exactly
path. No, I agree with you. Which brings me to the last concept I want to talk to you about, which you've mentioned in your paper called the inter-AI years, right? I think throughout our conversation, we've been talking about the fact that, it's early years, much is yet to be seen on how this develops. But talk to us both about the concept of the AI years, which I thought was very nicely framed. But also then I want to focus the next few minutes of our conversation on the opportunities that you see that are there to be taken, to be grabbed in these inter-AI years, these early years of AI.
Yeah, for sure. So the topic, the concept is that, again, these technologies crashed into the public consciousness some 18 months ago. And so we're super early on in this. And as we talked about at the very onset of the discussion, it's consequential for national competitiveness. This is a period of time in which a period of years here in front of us, as this technology matures, where countries will begin to express their unique strategies, predilections, and approaches to leveraging and harnessing this technology. And so, we will wake up in a period of, I don't know whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, where those approaches and those strategies will have been hardened. This is a period of experimentation and learning by nations to figure out what is going to be their approach and strategy here. And so it's a uniquely flexible, like a moment of adaptation and learning in global communities about how to harness these technologies, and a time when nations sort of need to grab the wheel and take on that burden of addressing this technology, figuring out how they want to leverage it, figuring out what are the appropriate guardrails for it, and how it will factor into their future strategies as a country or as a region. And so I thought it was I give Jared credit for he came up with the concept, but we see it in our dialogue with countries and regions now.
But what about businesses as well? Right? Every tech wave in the past in history, we've seen this, and I've written about this in my book. Many people have talked about this. With every new wave of technology comes a whole new set of winners and losers. Business models get appended, right? A Kodak loses out, a Nokia loses out, etc. Right? Many examples. We don't have to list them out. So from the vantage point that you sit in as well, right, which is in the private sector largely as well, and not just on the country and geopolitical side, do you see risks of certain kinds of business models or certain kinds of sectors, their business models being appended here, like what an Amazon did to retail and so on and so forth?
It's super fascinating. Again, as a fellow historian of technology change, this feels a little bit different in that the early dominant parties here are incumbents, right, in large part. OpenAI is probably an exception to that rule, but with an asterisk because of its association with Microsoft. And so, again, we're so early, it's hard to tell. And in fact, at a conference we helped sponsor last May, Bill Gates himself was asked, is this phenomenon going to be the province of large companies or small, incumbents or emerging competitors? And he said, I don't know, 50-50, which is sort of interesting given his background and association with Microsoft. So look, the early history of this is unusually favorable for incumbents, but it's so early, so disruptive in its impact that I wouldn't rule out the rise of new disruptive platforms that really change the directionality or define the ultimate directionality of this.
Yeah. No, this has been fascinating, George. I think as one would expect from two graduates of liberal arts colleges who've got the business world and are looking at the intersection of tech and geopolitics, we've covered a wide span of topics and perspectives. So thank you for taking the time. I end every podcast with two quick questions.
Good.
Which hopefully are simpler than the questions we've been grappling with. One, which is, a book that you read recently that you would recommend. And second would be a guest for our podcast as well.
Oh, okay. That's great. So the book is, I can't miss an opportunity. First, it is the most recent book I've read, but I can't miss an opportunity to promote my partner's new book. So Jared Cohen, in his spare time, writes absolutely beautiful books. His most recent is a book called Life After Power, and it is an examination of 7 U.S. presidents with the question of what did they do after they had occupied what one could submit is the most powerful job in the world.
Yeah.
And how did their post-presidential careers kind of define their characters, or what did it reveal about their characters? And it is brilliant, and it's just so interesting to see. And so it's both a great presidential history, but also a disquisition or a reflection on a question we all ask ourselves: what's next? And so, super. I highly recommend it. And in terms of next,
and anything on the tech and geopolitics side as well, or tech geopolitics history side as well.
let's see, tech and geopolitics. Let's see what I'm. Well, look, it's just a chance to commend your book, which I thought was fantastic, and it's not a paid advertisement, but I really thought it was very insightful, and so commend that to your listeners. They've probably all read it already, and then. In terms of other guests, gosh, I mean, first of all, I think you should definitely have a discussion with Jared. His view of geopolitics far more refined and impactful than mine. One that I just listened to is a dear friend of mine. This guy named David Eagleman. David is a neuroscientist and prolific author himself. His study of the brain is super revealing and inspiring and interesting as it relates to thinking about the future trajectory of AI. Neural networks and the predicate for artificial intelligence are largely modeled on the neural structure of the human brain. Sure. And so, while it's not something he talks a lot about, his perspectives on the brain and then trying to transport that into thinking about the directionality of this technology, I think could be fascinating. And he's just a very amusing, fun, interesting guy. So David Eagleman, entrepreneur, author, professor at Stanford.
No, perfect. These are great recommendations. Thanks so much, George. This has been a great discussion, and we look forward to having you more and more in India as well. And to continue to have these sessions that we have, these jamming sessions almost on
love it
of tech, AI, geopolitics, and history. So thank you so much for taking the time again.
All right. Thank you, Anirudh. And look forward to our next discussion.